But if you turn the sign around and it says PF, many people, I find, and I see this very often, think it is pianoforte, but it is not pianoforte. It's actually, hi, this is Danai, and today's video is going to be all about musical notation, musical signs, and how they have changed throughout time. Obviously, this is a huge subject and many different books have been written on this matter, so I will by no means be able to cover this topic in one short video alone. But while studying different pieces, certain things concerning musical signs keep coming up and certain thoughts repeat themselves whenever I think about this. So I kind of decided to compile all of my thoughts that come to my mind very quickly when thinking about notation and musical signs and just put them in one video. So look at this video as a kind of thought collection on this subject. Before I get into any detail, I think it is very important that we all keep in mind that different signs mean different things in different musical eras. Especially when talking about the piano, we are talking about very different instruments depending on which century we are in. So for example, talking about the cembalo, we have an instrument that cannot even produce a difference in dynamics because we don't have a hammer that actually hits against the string, but the string is being plucked. Then going to the forte piano from more of the classical era, we have also a very different piano than, for example, the piano that we have today. So it is also very important to always keep in mind what were the instruments made of, how did they sound, what would a forte, for example, sound like on that specific instrument in order to understand what the composers actually meant when writing their things down in the score. Another thing is that composers very often just played the pieces themselves, or if they didn't, because they were written for an instrument that they didn't play, they probably very closely collaborated with the musicians that did. So very often they just didn't write every detail into the score. They kind of knew how it was meant and they just told the performers, this is what I want, so please play it like that. Or also they knew the performers so well, so that, for example, if it was a performer that tended to be quite a loud player, they might have written some extra pianos in order to make sure that he doesn't play it too loudly. So what I want to say by that is that we always have to put all the notation and everything that is written in the score into context in order to understand what it means. So with all that said, let's get into the video. The first general subject I want to discuss is the subject of dynamics. Dynamics, as I already mentioned in my introduction, are something that kind of developed throughout time. As I said, the cembalo didn't even have dynamics, so a lot was done using timing instead of using louder and softer sound because it wasn't possible to do this on the cembalo. Of course, this gives us the big question of how do we, for example, want to play a piece that was written on the cembalo on the modern piano today. And the opinions differ a lot. Some say we should try to reproduce the cembalo sound, and some say we should try to make it sound good on the modern piano. Personally, I'm a fan of trying to make it sound beautiful and alive on the modern piano since we have these means at our disposal now. But just keep in mind, when you see a Baroque piece written for cembalo and there are no dynamics, it doesn't necessarily mean that it is supposed to all sound the same. It's just how it was at that time. However, the composer might have had a very lively and very interesting interpretation in his mind and might have done a lot of that by using timing. Now, moving further along in time, we have a very famous composer, Mozart, from the classical era, who had instruments that were very capable of producing different dynamics, and he actually didn't write a lot of dynamics into the score. Most of it is up to the musicians to decide, and I think once again that this is because he himself played a lot or conducted a lot and kind of told the people what he wanted. But it is important for us as musicians playing his music to know that he, for example, comes from this world of opera with different voices, different characters, and I find that in his music you can almost always hear something operatic. Funny comedic voice coming from the background, a bass voice that is very deep and vibrating, and all of these things. So when he only writes, let's say, forte, and then for a couple of pages, nothing else, it definitely doesn't mean play forte until there's something else written in the score. I think that especially in that case, you really have to think about what could this be? What kind of a scene could this be? Maybe this is a subito, maybe this is a voice from far away. I think these are very helpful thoughts when studying Mozart. Talking about Beethoven, his forte possibly means something different from Mozart's forte. He already started to use some bigger, louder pianos and also was kind of testing the boundaries of the instruments. So I would say that a Beethoven forte or fortissimo has a different kind of sound and dynamic than a Mozart fortissimo. And as time progressed, composers started writing down the dynamics more precisely so that we also know better what exactly they meant. I find that there is one important clarification that I want to make because I think it is a very common misconception. We all know the FP, fortepiano, what that means. It means forte and then immediately subito piano. It can be written on one single note, which what I would do there on the piano when you have this chord with a fortepiano is actually change the pedal, just go halfway up in order to have the sound slightly go out. I talked about this in my previous video about pedaling, so if you're interested in that, check that out. But if you turn the sign around and it says PF, many people I find, and I see this very often, think it is pianoforte, but it is not pianoforte, it's actually poco forte. And poco forte actually means a little loud, if you want to translate it literally. So in the dynamics, it comes before forte, but it is by no means anything connected to piano. It is a forte dynamic, it is a little loud. Johannes Brahms has a very interesting description of this musical sign, poco forte. He says it means with the character of forte, but with the sound of piano, which I find is a very interesting way of putting it and maybe actually quite to the point. Another important misconception that I want to mention is that when you see a diminuendo or a crescendo, the start of the, let's say if it's a crescendo, the start of the crescendo, so when it is still right here at the beginning, doesn't mean that it has to be loud already. The start of the crescendo is still a very low point. I think this is a very common mistake that happens, that we already feel like we have to be loud when we see crescendo in the score. When you see crescendo in the score, remind yourself, okay, I still have to be soft and quiet. And only as the crescendo progresses, depending on how long it takes to develop this specific crescendo, the sound increases. And same with a decrescendo or a diminuendo. The beginning of the diminuendo is not piano, is not soft. It is still very much loud, and then it only gradually goes down. One last thought concerning dynamics is that I would encourage you to very often not take dynamics literally, but to see it as a kind of indication of the character. Also referring to what Brahms said about the poco forte, a dynamic description can also be something that is an indication towards the character. Like a forte character, a very happy, alive, celebratory character doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be super loud all the time. It means that maybe you have a feeling of a joyous dance or something like that. So yeah, also think about dynamics as a character. For me, this has helped a lot. Now I want to talk about the pedal. Whenever you have pedal written in the score, again, it is very important to remember how our instruments have changed, how the pedal worked on instruments from the 17th, 18th century. When talking about the pianoforte, which is the piano of, let's say, Beethoven, Mozart, Beethoven time. First of all, the piano itself was not as loud as the concert grand piano that we have today. And also when you press the pedal, the sound that stayed from the vibrating strings was gone after a few notes because it wasn't that strong. So I want to give you a very famous example of what I believe is a pedal misconception. In Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, there is a pedal indication that is original, and it is in the first movement. It says, press the pedal with the first note. So you press it, and then at the end of the entire first movement, most of you will definitely know how long that movement is, how many harmonic changes there are within the first movement of Moonlight Sonata. So at the end, it says lift it back up. So basically, play the whole movement in one pedal with 0 changes. Now, I went to a pianoforte because at my university, we thankfully have different instruments that we are allowed to try and practice, which is really great and very interesting in order to create an informed interpretation. So I went to a pianoforte when I was studying and I pressed the pedal, played the first movement of Moonlight Sonata and lifted it at the end. And it sounded beautiful. It did not sound the same way it would sound if I did that on a modern grand piano. I also tried it on a modern grand piano, and in my personal opinion, it does not sound good. It sounds terrible because you have all these harmonies mixing, and in the end, you can't really hear anything. It just sounds like a cacophony. So for me, what this means is that I will try to take that feeling of having this slightly blurry sound, but still very clear notes that is created on the forte piano when I press the pedal all the way. And I'm going to try to transfer it onto my modern grand piano, which means that, of course, I will make some changes when the harmonies change drastically. Maybe I'll use a little bit of vibrato pedal. But I think this is a great example to show you how we have to remember why the composers put certain musical indications and signs into the score and what they meant to them in that time. The next subject that I want to mention are trills. The origin kind of is of the so-called Pralltriller that Bach used very often, which actually at the beginning was not written out as a TR trill like we know it today, but actually as this kind of a sign, like a wave with corners. I don't know if that's a good description, but this was a trill that was always started on the upper note, so not on the main note, and was just seen as a little bit of an ornament in order to make it sound a little more alive, maybe when you repeat something or just when you want to create a little bit of fun to the melody. If the upper note in the melody precedes the trill though, and that would mean that you would have to start with the upper note twice, then you are supposed to play it from the principal note. So this is kind of the rule that I would say is quite helpful when deciding how to play the trill. The opposite of the Pralltriller was the mordent, which started on the main note and then went downwards. And this had the sign of the edgy wave with a line going through it. So these are the two main ornaments that Bach used: Pralltriller starting from the upper note and then interchanging with the main note, and the mordent starting from the main note and just 3 notes playing the main note, the one beneath, and then again the main note. The trill of course evolved, and a question that I get asked often and that I have also asked myself very often is, which notes should I start my trill from? The main note or the upper note? Generally, I would say the upper note. If you're talking about Mozart, I would say it is kind of a rule that it is the upper note. If you're talking about Chopin, he actually has written down that he thinks that generally they should be started on the upper note only if they are preceded by a small note, which is the main note. Is that the indication that he wants them to start from the main note? So if the trill is preceded by a small note, it doesn't mean to play that note twice, but it actually means start it from the main note. The next subject that I want to generally just touch on are accents. Accents can mean so many different things. An accent does not only mean play this note a little harshly or accentuated. An accent can mean that a note should be a little bit longer and you should use a little bit of agogic in order to make it sound accentuated. So not necessarily louder or harsher, but just a little bit longer and give it that little bit of extra time. An accent can also mean that within one chord, one note should stand out and therefore it has an accent. So the accent is not necessarily for the entire chord, but just for one note that is supposed to be the melody or that is supposed to stand out for some reason. An accent can also mean that the note should be held a little bit longer. So concerning accents, it really is important to look at the context and to see where the phrase comes from, what it could mean. Definitely, I would try to avoid taking accents very literally whenever they come up. Also, I think it is important to distinguish between different signs that are symbols for accents. There is, of course, the accent that we all know that looks like a mimi diminuendo. Then there are different signs. There is the RF, which is rinforzando. There is the SF, which means sforzando. And there is the FZ, which is forzando. And these three things actually mean different things. Rinforzando translated means reinforced. So basically reinforce the sound a little bit, but it is not supposed to be as harsh as an accent. Sforzando is supposed to be a sudden, strong accent on a note or a chord. And forzando is the sharp accenting of a note or also a group of notes. So I think this is also important to kind of differentiate and to not, for example, think that the rinforzando means a very sharp accent, because it actually doesn't. Also, I had a misconception for a very long time. There is this sign, which is this vertical line above a note, and for a very long time I thought that this actually meant something like a little accent, but very often this actually just simply means take it away, and I didn't know that for a long time. I thought I had to accentuate every note that had that, but it actually just means don't play it legato. It means non-legato. It's always interesting to look into signs, and if something seems a little bit strange to you and you think to yourself, why is there this weird accent there? Definitely look into the context, and maybe you'll find what it could mean and how it could make sense to you. The last general thing I want to touch on is the length of notes. The length of notes is obviously indicated by how the note is notated, whether it's a half note, a quarter note, an eighth, and all of that. But also there is legato, there is staccato, there is non-legato, portato, and all of these things. However, I find that there are some other things also indicating the length of notes. Actually, Mozart's father, Leopold Mozart, wrote in his book, whenever there is a slur, when that slur ends, it means that this note should be a little bit shorter than what is written. And if you think about this, it actually totally makes sense. If you have a phrase and the end of the phrase is the end of the slur, you probably don't want to end the phrase by holding that note, which very often, let's say if the phrase is made up of quarter notes, the last note might be a half note. You don't want to hold it until the end. It is kind of natural to just lift it, just the same as when you speak. When I end my sentence, I don't say sentence and make sure to end it completely, but I kind of lift my voice, and that way you would also lift the last note at the end of a slur or at the end of a phrase and make it that tiny bit shorter. Of course, there is staccato, which is kind of obvious, I think, just a short, very shorter note than what is written. And there is also portato, which is a tenuto and a staccato on top. If you have a tenuto, which is just a line above the note, it means you have to hold it a little bit longer. If you have a staccato, which is a dot, it means you have to hold it a little bit shorter than what is written. There is also the case that you have both, a line with a dot on top, which is a portato, which means kind of something like a long staccato. Another very interesting indication to me is the slur with staccato underneath it. That, for pianists, is very interesting, because what this actually means is that you press the pedal and then play staccato notes in the pedal without changing it. It is a very beautiful effect, and basically it usually is when you have a melody within one harmony where it makes sense not to change the pedal. The accompaniment kind of goes through and you have repeating notes, or also not repeating notes, maybe different ones, and you have them short, which kind of gives them a ring and makes them sound very brilliant. But then at the same time, you keep the pedal down, which creates the illusion of a slur. So this can also be a different meaning of portato, the slur connected to staccato dots. The last thought that I have in my mind is the difference between ritenuto and ritardando. Ritenuto actually means that the tempo should suddenly get slower. Ritenuto means held back. So it's kind of a subito in the tempo, slower, and then the whole ritenuto passage should be played a little bit slower. Ritardando or also rallentando are the same thing, and those two things mean that you should gradually get slower. So the beginning of a ritardando is actually still in tempo, and then you slowly get slower as the ritardando progresses. I find that this is also very often a misconception that we see a ritenuto but actually play a ritardando and vice versa. Yes, so these were my thoughts concerning all kinds of musical signs and notation and what they mean and how it translates into our playing. I know this video was a little bit all over the place, but I just found it important to compile these thoughts in one place. So I really hope that you found this helpful in some way and interesting. Let me know what you think. I'm sure that you have many different thoughts on this subject as well, and I know that I didn't touch on many things, so feel free to add a lot in the comments and any things that you find important that I did not mention. And I'm very curious to see what you're going to write and also what you think about what I said, if you agree or if you don't agree with some of the things that I mentioned. And I'll see you again in the next video. Bye!